All right, hello everybody. Welcome to a discussion of The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. And we have a couple different editions to show off here. And Varsha from Reading by the Rainy Mountain and I have already discussed the first 8 issues of The Sandman, and that discussion is over on Varsha's channel. There will be a link to that in the description. But we are continuing today with the next 8 issues. And I'm going to just read the titles of the issues really quickly. 6 of them are very much the story of Rose. And there are these great epigraphs that start out this section. One is, dreams and visions are infused into men for their advantage and instruction. This is Artemidoros at Daldus from the 2nd century AD. And the second epigraph is, dreams are weird and stupid and they scare me. That's Rose Walker. That's Rose Walker. And you can understand that by the end of these 8 issues, why she might say something like that. But we are recovering Tales in the Sand, The Doll's House, Moving In, Playing House, Men of Good Fortune, Collectors, Into the Night, and Lost Hearts. I'll probably list those in the description as well to make life easier. So with all of that, my goodness, I feel like I just said a lot. I'd like to introduce my 2 wonderful guests. For some reason or other, I thought maybe AP would be would want to join us. I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that you wrote a master's thesis on the Sandman. Do you think that might have something to do with it, AP?
A little bit.
Well, it is actually a delight to have you here, my nemesis. And I really am excited because I know you have a lot to say about this. This is a very important text for you in many ways. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I have a personal connection to it that I'm not going to go into here, but
Okay.
it was important for a very personal reason when I was reading it. But I've talked a lot about how I got into fantasy literature and why I started to really engage with fantasy literature. The Sandman series of comics was what made me start thinking about the importance of story, of narrative, and was the thing nudging me toward the study of narratology. It Gaiman's Gaiman's run of the Sandman was these series that really inspired me to think about the importance of story.
Wow.
Story across culture, story across medium, story across age, all these different aspects of story, but how it shapes our lives, how it shapes our cultures, how it shapes our perception of reality. And so much of the sort of meta commentary in The Sandman engages with the importance of story, the power of story, and the danger of story. Because anything that powerful, anything that can have that effect on us, if wielded improperly or if wielded with the wrong intention, can be enormously damaging. And yet it also has the ability to raise us all up, to join us together, to connect us, and to show us the links between us, no matter how different and diverse our backgrounds and our cultures and our ages and whatever. We can all be brought together by story. So
Nice.
that's why this series, out of all of the work that Gaiman has done, and I have read pretty much everything, this series remains the work of Neil Gaiman's that I hold above all others.
Yeah. I don't think you're alone in that. I get the sense that this is immensely popular. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's a series that has affected a lot of people in deep ways. And it seems to be one that delves right into the heart of human experience in so many ways. That it does feel very dreamlike while reading these episodes. And I include when I say dreamlike, there are nice dreams where you're flying, and never mind what Freud says about that. And then there are these there are these really creepy dreams that you wake up from thinking, oh God, why do we have dreams? So yeah, it covers all that. So that's beautifully said. And then my other guest here, obviously, is Varsha from Reading by a Rainy Mountain, and Varsha and I. Varsha is the one who actually nudged me to finally start reading The Sandman because I had meant to do it for so long. I'm a big fan of American Gods. I love The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I also enjoyed Neil Gaiman's retellings of Norse myths. So those are the things that I've read of his previously and loved them all. And just thinking all these years, wow, I can I call myself a Neil Gaiman fan without reading The Sandman? I don't know. But now I'm correcting that regardless. So Varsha, I want to thank you for that, and also welcome you because I had a great time last time, and it's so great to see you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Philip. I'm really happy to be here with the two people whose friendship and arch nemesis would encouraged me to start my own channel. So I'm really
Well,
happy to be here to discuss a
sometimes
favorite series.
sometimes nemesises can be inspiring. So so we are going to start off with Tales in the Sand. And I don't know if people need a reminder or not, but this is the one that is six of these are very clearly connected. They are the story of Rose Walker. Fundamentally, she is the protagonist, central character of six of these. There are two of these, the first being Tales in the Sand, that may seem less connected, but there are little connections in there, aren't there? And so that's something maybe we can talk about a little bit first. AP, do you want to cover that? What are the connections between Tales in the Sand and the earlier eight that we read? I know there's going to be some more that we can't talk about yet, but the earlier eight issues that we read, and all other issues that we have read for today. What's important to know about Tales in the Sand?
Well, Tales in the Sand, although we've seen hints of this earlier, but Tales in the Sand gets across that this series might be called The Sandman, but it doesn't mean it's going to be following the Sandman's adventures. Because Dream, while important to this story that is a story within a story, and we can get into talk about diegetic levels, but Dream is not the central character and is not the protagonist. And it's actually at the heart of the nested story within this female character.
Did you use the word heart on purpose there?
And it's Nada, the queen.
Nada.
And we had met her previously in a cell in hell
Yeah.
when Dream was walking down into hell. And we had that moment when one of the prisoners speaks to him, and we see Dream perceived as this sort of Maasai warrior. And it's because, of course, all of our dreams are shaped by our own personal perception. So she sees Dream the way that she has always seen Dream. And it's not necessarily the way that we see Dream, or because Dream is shaped by who is perceiving him.
Right.
And so that was the story of Nara. And she was saying, like, have you forgiven me? And Dream's like, nope. Because let's face it, Dream's a bit of an arse.
Yes.
Um,
It's for sure. That is for sure. And Varsha and I were remarking last time how, in some ways, the series seems to be Dream or Morpheus or whatever you want to call him, learning humanity, learning empathy, learning compassion in some ways. And we see moments in here where clearly he lacks that. So that is one of them for sure. Yeah.
and it's quite curious. I think it will come up more when we talk about Hobbes' storyline and Dream meeting up with him every century. But Dream is a the anthropomorphic representation of an ideal. And you think there's not a lot of wiggle room in that for personal growth, because he is a representation that has been created. He's an abstract ideal given form. And yes, he has a sort of personality, but he is defined by his function. And a lot of what we see here is from the beginning, we had Dream basically in crisis, something that had happened to him that had never happened before. And he is now working through the ramifications and repercussions of that, which means rethinking previous events in his life, things that he was certain about, things that he did. And he was like, yes, I was right to have done that. But now, because of his experience being confined, because of what happened to the dreaming, He's now slowly working through that. And it takes time. You know, people sometimes say, oh, well, that thing happened. Why haven't you just changed immediately? You generally not how psychology works. But this is part of this process. And the way that Gaiman relays this to the reader is obviously like we saw him at that crisis point. We're following on with the ramifications. And now we're slowly getting these moments where we get essentially flashbacks. We're finding out about Dream's past. And this Tales in the Sand is a story of someone telling a story, a secret story, a private story, a story that is personal to them and who they are as a people. And even then, it's divided into, well, there was the male story and then the women's story that we don't get told, that could have been different, that may have emphasized different things. There are elements in that of, we can see, you know, drawing on Greek myth, whether this is meant to be what inspired the Greek myth, or the tale of this sort of why the weaver bird is brown, these origin stories that explain the natural world. Those elements are weaved in. And it's almost like this giant patchwork where we see how these different elements have come together. And the people telling the story in this oral tradition have woven these disparate elements into a single narrative. Because that's what happens with our stories over time, that they get conflated, they get mashed together. And so the connection to Nada in Hell, Dream now being moved away from being the central character. Oh, how is Dream going to solve this thing? It's not about that anymore. It's looking at the impact of Dream. And Dream is always important. Dream is always central to what is going on, but not necessarily the focus of the story. And I think it sets it out very, very neatly here, and also moves it away from the very American or Western sort of basis that a lot of the earlier stories had. That it's no, Dream is for everyone. That this is a concept and a story that applies in every culture, and it broadens the aspect of it away from sort of DC and Vertigo's initial sort of focus on the American superhero focus that this sort of was a horror spin-off of. Yeah. More into, no, we're moving into a wider world and a broader world.
Yeah, I personally love it when Gaiman gets more mythological and universal. Those are my favorite moments, not only so far in The Sandman, but also in American Gods, and I love his Norse myth retellings. So he seems to do a great job of plugging into that level of narrative, the mythological, universal level. So Varsha, what did you think of Tales in the Sand as a kind of one of the more mythological moments in the series so far?
I really loved how it started with the telling of the story, and how there are so many stories that you tell every night to fall asleep, and then there's just one story, the mysterious aspect of it, where there's this one story that's only ever told once to each person. And then towards the end, I was really happy to find out what was up with Nada, because that really bugged me in the first volume. So that was cool, the tie back to what we saw in the previous volume. And overall, I did really, really enjoy the way the story was told. Even the words, like I've been reading some manga recently, and the words don't matter too much usually. It's just, yeah, this is happening. But it feels like with this comic, even the words mean so much. Like I love the way the sentences are formed, and how pretty it was when he was telling the story. Yeah, so I really enjoyed the whole sequence.
Yeah,
a lot.
You brought up something important there, which is the idea that this act of storytelling is a ritual. It is a ritual of introducing a new phase of someone's life, of maturity. You're an adult now because you're hearing this story. What about this story? This is a question for both of you. What is it about this story that relates to this stage of one's life, of maturity? Is there something inherent in the story that would suggest that you're moving on from a more childish phase to a more adult phase. Anyone want to take that one?
Varsha, do you want to speak first?
Let me think a little bit. So that's a great question. I didn't think about it like that. Um, but there's so many things happening in the story, right? It talks about the destruction of their people. It tells them who they were. They are given information about who they are that they probably didn't know before. And is there an element of they also want to hide it from outsiders that they came from this
Correct.
hyper civilized culture. So I guess there's a few things that I could think of this. You're now old enough to protect information. We trust you with it. There's that aspect, perhaps. And then you're I guess the question of sacrifice because she chooses to not stay with Dream even though she was so desperate to find him because she thought she loved him. And so, the teaching about sacrifice, what you may have to do for your people as an adult. What else? I think, yeah, and then being taught some horrible truths about the destruction of their civilization. So there's a lot of adult elements to the story that I suppose you are now ready to understand, or I trust you to understand. That's probably what I'd interpret that as.
Yeah. Thank you. Excellent. AP, you want to add to that?
Well, I think those are all excellent points, and I would agree with that. That's a fantastic way of looking at it. Something that potentially could be added to it would be as a as an aspect of becoming an adult. This theme that Varsha was just talking about. This is not a fairy tale with a happy ending.
Mm.
This is the cold hard truth about about power, the abuse of power, about how these things can destroy you, can have ramifications outside of yourself. And like in this story, Nada initially is not necessarily selfish, but she is prideful. And you can make a lot of the connections to Greek mythology here about pride and hubris. And she decides that the only being good enough for her is a god. But when she realizes he's not just a god, he is of the endless. And so we're getting more knowledge that some mortals know about the endless. And this was part of how evolved and advanced their people were. And she realizes because he's of the endless, no, this can't happen because this will cause devastation. And then Dream, much like a Greek god, then feels spurned and enacts his revenge. And it's no, I'm going to force you to do this. And oh, look what you made me do. Like it really is quite cruel and heartless because he refuses to see her position. And so her initial arrogance and hubris brings about an aspect of this. But then Dream's hubris and arrogance and need to be right dooms not only her, but her people, her city, all of these innocent people. And if this had been a childhood story, a childish story, maybe they would have lived happily ever after
Mm.
in Neverland, off in the dream world. Oh, she found her prince and they lived happily ever after. But that is not what this story is. This story is now that you're an adult, know the ramifications and responsibilities that come with that. Not all knowledge is pretty. Not all knowledge of our past and our culture is rosy and comforting. Sometimes there is darkness there. And it is part of who we are. It is part of where we come from. And we do well to be aware of it. But there are lessons here to be learned.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was a beautiful, as part of a coming of age story, this glimpse into an adult world rather than the childish dreams of a Disneyfied happy ending.
Hmm. There's also a nice little here at the end, we have the heart that you alluded to earlier, which is part of that glass city. And
I did desire to talk about that at some point.
yes, very nice. I noticed you said Rosie earlier too. It's the heart thing comes up in Rose's and Unity's story later on. So it is something I think about that Gaiman is definitely returning to several times here. Is the heart as a symbol of human emotion, as a symbol of human experience, and something that, again, Dream is slowly, I think, circling around and coming to understand more and more in the process of this tale as it unfolds. So we should probably, unless you have anything urgent to say about Tales in the Sand, we should move on. Any last thoughts?
Just to build on some of the aspects that you were talking about in your earlier discussion, and also that Varsha mentioned here, it's not just the words on the page, and the images we get are not simple illustrations of this is what's happening. It's not just this is what's happening on the page. How these things are arranged, the use of the different layering of the images and the different coloring of the panels to
Uh,
in particular the Sandman and the excellent work done by all of the artists on it, how it is relayed to the reader, how the panels are organized, the colors being used. And we see later on when panels are suddenly set askew, or all of that is really important in terms of storytelling and how the story is being communicated. And in fact, you could probably go through and spend at least an hour or 2 hours going through each and every page, talking about the different panels, what they're emphasizing, what they're de-emphasizing, how the transitions between them are being used, how the gutter, the white space between panels is being utilized, and then certain images and aspects that are being dropped in, and they serve as foreshadowing for other things, but they also are connections running through all of the different elements of the story. And I just wanted to mention that because so often, because of my bias, I lean towards the words on the page, the story that is being told. And I forget to talk about how important the artwork is, not just in representing the words, but in communicating tone and atmosphere and in telling its own story. And it's the coming together of both those things is the whole package.
Yeah, I mean, these images that we get between the issues are often foreshadowing, telling us what's to come, and also very atmospheric. You know, they set the tone in many ways for the story. And we get right at the start of the next issue another heart, right? And we keep coming again and again to these hearts. So I think that's interesting. That I don't know if it's. I'm sure Gaiman knew what he was doing, but this is a very tortured heart, and it's at the center of this giant statue that belongs to Desire, who we learn in the course of this has been really manipulating things behind the scenes in order to get at her big brother Dream in so many ways. It's playing the kind of the villain behind the curtain, I guess, in some ways. It seems like, anyway, at this point, Desire. Do I have that right?
Yeah, interestingly, it was something that with the TV show of the Sandman, Gaiman was actually speaking about this, and he had mentioned that if he could go back, one of the things that he wished he could go back and change was Desire is he, she,
Right.
and unfortunately in the comic, it. And
Sometimes.
given,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's quite often Desire, because Desire is male and female and everything,
Now we would
uh,
say they. Yeah.
and we would now say they
Yeah.
because it is quite dehumanizing.
Right.
And that's not the point of desire. So, and it's such a tiny change, and yet
Important.
um,
Yeah.
it's an important one. And you
Yeah.
can understand why, like looking at it now, 30 years on, going, yeah, if we changed that, it would read better. It would be more interesting. It wouldn't be quite as dehumanizing,
Yeah.
particularly when desire is both complex, a villain as well as a character in their own right. And again, as an anthropomorphic representation of an ideal,
Right.
fixed in their role. And they are a fascinating character in this. And I love how the different realms are articulations and expressions of the sort of the concept they're bound up in. So Dream is surrounded by a library and these stories.
Yeah.
Desire lives on their own in their heart in a giant statue worshiping them.
Yeah. So in this particular issue, though, we meet briefly as well Despair before we get into the main narrative, with Rose and her mother arriving in London and eventually meeting up with Rose's, as it turns out, grandmother, Unity Kincaid, whom, as you pointed out, we met in one of the earliest volumes as one of the children who had basically lost their lives because being in this dream sickness or the sleep sickness while Dream was held captive. And one of the things that I find interesting, you were talking about how just a minor thing, but you were talking about how the visuals can add so much. It was interesting how this transitioned where initially we're, the way you would expect the pages to be, I guess, horizontal or whatever, or vertical rather. And then suddenly when she starts dreaming, we have to hold it like this. And when we're in the dream world, you have to actually shift the book around, which got a little annoying for me, but I was admiring it at the same time. I thought, oh, this is cool. Okay. And then when we got back to, when we're with Dream in the dream world, we're holding it like this. Thank goodness that's not always the case. But in this particular issue, they did, Gaiman did that, or the illustrators did it. And I thought that was kind of cool. But what were some of the things that you guys want to talk about from this? And we can do anything, I think, from the Doll's House and moving in and playing house. We could go through all three of those, I think, because they are fairly interconnected. But starting out with the Doll's House, there is a really interesting scene when she meets the three Fates, the three Norns, who can change face and apparently transform into animals as well. So that was a cool moment, I felt. Again, mythological. I love those mythological moments. The three Fates or the Norns or whatever. They're in a lot of different mythologies. Maiden, Mother, Crone, and all that stuff. So, what were some things from the Doll's House or on that you want to cover? Varsha, anything that that stood out to you in meeting our protagonist here, Rose, and her mother, and the whole moment when she meets her grandmother, Unity Kincaid?
Yeah, I think she's introduced to us as the dream vortex, right? So there's a lot of curiosity around what a dream vortex is and what the implications are there. And I, I do I remember correctly that Dream seems surprised that a dream vortex is coming up now, or was that later? But yeah, I think
Yes.
in
Yes.
Mhm. And being introduced as the dream vortex, of course, tells us immediately why she's the main character here that we need to pay attention to. And so I kept looking for signs about what is it that I don't think she's dreaming, and that's all we know so far. She doesn't do anything special with her dreaming. So yeah, it's interesting, something to look out for, I guess, in future issues. And then, yeah, it was nice to see some people that we saw in the first issue again, like the triple goddess, who was slightly less intense in this issue than
Yeah.
they were in the previous one. And yeah, and I think I read this a long time ago. I'd forgotten that a lot of the characters from the first issue came back. They felt When we were reading it last time, it felt like, yeah, just episodes and we're done with them. But like in the first story, Nada came back, and now we have this whole arc centered around Unity. So they weren't just introduced for the sake of it. So I really appreciate that for some reason. So it was nice to follow up with Unity, see where she's at now, her daughter and granddaughter, and that she's looking for them. Like even though, and I guess the other interesting aspect of this for me was she wasn't conscious when she had the child, but she still had this desire to go find them and see how she can help them or like just get to know them. So that bit was really interesting for me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how in the dream panels you have the last one is Lucian directly looking at you, and we realize, oh, she's really seeing them. Like this is her, we're getting her perspective here in at this moment as she's dreaming. And we do get, as you said, those nice little cameos from Cain and Abel and some of the earlier people inhabiting the dream world. So that's some lovely stuff. AP, what do
And of
you
course,
want to say? Yeah,
I was going to say, and part of that, it serves the function that she's not just having a dream.
right.
Because we already know who Cain and Abel are and who Lucian is, we know that she's actually in the dreaming, that this isn't some frivolous dream. And you have one of the things that Gaiman does throughout the series is he has these wonderful moments of echoing and repetition. So Rose is in the corner of the room watching Dream and Lucian. And then when we are with Rose and Unity in the bedroom and you see the doll's house in the corner, and Dream is in the doll's house watching them. And
It's great.
it's just that nice sort of echo. And the fact that you have this doll's house. And then, of course, when she goes to try and find Jed, she moves into essentially a replica of that doll's house. And, you know, the different characters within it forming archetypes and symbols, and how as her power is breaking down, or is breaking down the barriers in reality and dreaming, how they all start to flow into one another, and you get that wonderful maelstrom effect. But one of the things I really liked here was the discussion of an amulet, the type of ring, and Unity giving this ring to Rose. And of course, later on, we realize that that's now used as a symbolic link, that Unity should have been the vortex. And this is the logic she uses, the dream logic. I should have been the vortex. So if you give me the ring back, which is your heart inside the dreaming.
Yeah.
And again, linking everything to heart, everything to desire, everything to that symbol. And if you do that, then I can be the vortex again and you will be free of it.
Yep.
And you know, all of Desire's plan suddenly coming to the fore, that Desire had fathered this child with Unity while Unity was asleep, and did so deliberately, because if Dream had killed Rose, he would have been killing his grandniece,
Right. One of the family. Yeah.
one
Which
of the
is,
family.
it seems verboten. Yeah.
um and it it's these little links and connections that, how much Gaiman had planned in advance, I doubt we will ever know. Or whether it was, oh, I left that thing there, I'll pick it up now and I'll develop it into this thing. But the whole series functions that way, that there are all of these connections and threads that run all the way through that refer back to each other. And Gaiman was really, really good at going back and picking up these threads and developing them, and creating at least the illusion of cohesiveness. And that was really wonderful. So like, in that section in the dreaming where Lucian lists the four dreams that are missing,
The
the
major
four
ones.
major arcana,
Yeah.
and of course that's what we now follow in this whole section, is we see what happened to those four major arcana from the dreaming,
Brute,
including
Blob, the
Fiddler's
Corinthian,
Green,
and Fiddler's Green. Yeah. Yeah.
who it seems to be modeled on G.K. Chesterton.
Oh yeah. Huh. Yeah. Lovely. Yeah. I like that character a lot. Fiddler's Green. Or as she meets him, Gilbert. Yeah. Yeah. But this particular issue, the Doll's House ends ominously with the Corinthian, whom we don't even see. We get the perspective of the kid that he has tied up, and obviously the kid is looking in horror, and that really does, I think, a pretty effective job of getting us to feel pretty creepy about the Corinthian.
Doesn't it? Sorry, Philip. Isn't it? We are in the Corinthians' point of view.
Yeah,
looking
that's right.
at
We
their
don't see
victim.
him. We're looking out of his eyes. Yeah.
And you know, again, that's interesting. Where we were in Rose's perspective when she was dreaming.
Yeah.
We see dream, but from an external perspective.
It's super creepy. Yeah. Yeah.
And again, that use of perspective, that shifting of point of view, the use of the color grading again to signal different points of view, different perspectives.
Yeah.
That and also when the Corinthian takes off his glasses and the color changes slightly.
Yeah.
Um, that's what I meant earlier when I was talking about how it is being told, not just what is being told.
The one thing at least you can say for the Corinthian though is that he is always all smiles. So,
But it does take him 3 times as long to brush his teeth.
poor guy. You imagine how much floss he has to go through? Oh man.
His dentist loves him.
Oh, I'm sure. It's like a 3-in-1 appointment every time. I wonder if he has to do 3 separate hours. Anyway. Sorry, Varsha. So then I think we can move on to moving in, which is where we meet an eclectic cast of characters who live in this house in Florida that Rose is moving into. We meet Ken and Barbie, which is just what? How random can you get, Neil Gaiman? We meet Ken and Barbie, and we meet. They don't turn out to be sisters, but the Zelda and who's the
Chantal.
one that talks?
Chantal.
Chantal. That's right. Chantal and Zelda and the landlord as well, Hal. And finally, a little bit later, also living in the house is Gilbert, but it's also where we get poor Jed and the introduction of this very interesting comic
Hmm.
sequence. So, shall we begin with that and talk about anything that sticks out to you there? Either
Uh,
one of you.
what AP said earlier, I didn't realize this was a version of the dollhouse. So it makes so much more sense now that there's Ken and Barbie living in the dollhouse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I did wonder about this superhero person. I don't think it is the same, but in the first volume, we had there's a replacement Sandman who tried to fill the void that was created by Sandman being captured. I did wonder if this person was the same, but I don't think these two, I forget their names, but the monsters who were trying to play puppet master through them. Um, yeah, I don't think it was the same person, right? And the other one, they were.
I think AP can explain all that because AP, where you have some knowledge about where this particular comic form comes from. It's an allusion to DC Comics, of course, come up a lot in this, much more than in the show. They weeded that stuff out in the show, but here you do
Okay.
see a lot of references to DC. So you want to take a stab at explaining all that?
Under the proviso that it has been a long time since I had looked at all of the comic book connections, and I am not, and I've never claimed to be a comic book historian or expert, but from what I recollect, um, Lita is the daughter of Wonder Woman from one of the previous continuities that got wiped out when DC essentially rebooted, and her husband, who is the Sandman character there, was the son of Hawkman and Hawkgirl. Again, in a different continuity that got wiped out. So we're seeing those connections to previous DC comics, just like when we met Etrigan in Hell, that he is a DC Comics character who was cursed. The guy Blood was cursed to have this demon Etrigan inside him, and he changes into Etrigan, and Etrigan speaks in rhyme.
Mm.
So that is one aspect of this. That these are DC characters that essentially, when DC rebooted their universe, and for the life of me, I have temporarily forgotten the name of that whole sequence. It wasn't. I think it's Marvel was Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it was basically the DC equivalent, whichever way round it was. So what happened to all those characters? And here we have, well, they ended up in this dream that is an artificial, not proper dream inside this young boy's head.
Jed.
And the two dreams, the two arcana from the dreaming, have escaped. They've tried to form their own dream to be separate, where they can be in control of it and have somewhere to hide out and be happy. And the whole sequence that we see of Jed going on these adventures, that was the Adventures of Little Nemo in Slumberland, which was again like a very early comic book. And the sequence was, I think it was a 3x4 grid, or yeah, three. I think it was 3x4. So it was three panels, three panels, three panels, and then the last three. And it always was little Nemo going on an adventure somewhere in dreamland. And the last panel was always him waking up, like falling out of bed and going, "Oh, mama," because he'd had this dream and then woken up. And
here it's awful. He wakes up with this horrible abuser screaming, "Shut up, you little bastard," you know. Yeah.
And so this is the knockoff version of Little Nemo. Instead of it being wonderful dreams, it's actually a nightmarish version.
Yeah.
And it's because it's not being controlled by dream. It's being controlled by these slightly inept nightmares. And like, Varsha made like a really good point there about all the superhero connections and how these are the sort of the traditional dreams, but it's a very naive, childish form of them. They're not sophisticated. It's not the real sort of superhero story. It's the childish version. And we can see it's an escape that Jed has built up because of the abuse, has built up these defenses in his mind, which is what the nightmares are counting on in order to protect them. And so there's a lot tied into that of playing on the Adventures of Little Nemo, on the tying into the DC universe, and what happens to those characters when they get wiped out of their continuity. And it's we see them popping up here. And again, a sort of an external reason for this is characters that are no longer in DC continuity are fair game to be used in another DC project without offending or stepping on anyone's toes about, well, you know, if you put Batman in, well, but Batman, you have to make sure the continuity is right or the characterization is right. But if you use characters that are no longer in continuity, you can do much more with them. And it's a way of explaining where all of these different Sandman characters came from and tying it into the fact that the real Sandman, Morpheus, Oneiromancer, was captured. And therefore, there was a need that drove this creation and these people taking up the mantle. And so we get that explanation, and it helps solidify it and support it. And then we find out that they have been forcing the uncle and the aunt, or at least nudging the uncle and the aunt's behavior into mistreating Jed in order to make his abuse worse so that he builds up even stronger defenses. But there's a lot of nightmare fuel stuff going on in this.
Yeah, it's horrible, actually. Yeah. Yeah, a few other standout things, and then I want to get more of your reactions. But I thought it was clever how some of the storytelling happens where she's writing a letter to her mother, and so a lot of exposition happens there, which I think is very cool. Matthew the Crow plays a bit of a role here, and I get to know him a little more. And then Gilbert, of course, rescues Rose from the people, and we realize that he's going to be playing somewhat of a protector role in here. And so those were three things that stood out to me in this particular section. What in moving in, that is to say, but anything else that you two want to cover, make sure we talk about.
Did you notice that when she sees her room for the first time, Matthew's already at the window?
Yeah. Watching. Yeah.
And I thought that was really cool because, like, later on when she says, "Oh, you know, this raven's been outside the window," and then it shows Matthew being there, and sometimes there's one of the borders. It shows Matthew flying, and the flapping of the wings, and he's just flying along the border of the page.
Yeah.
But it's sort of when she mentions it, and you go, "Oh, and here's Matthew." But if you flick back, you actually see Matthew is already there, he was there from the beginning, and that's what she's referencing. It's little things like that that maybe you don't notice because you're focusing on the character and what the character is saying, and you're looking at that. Don't notice the background information, and yet that background information is part of what is being shown to us. And it's a very clever use of the imagery to say, no, you need, if we are showing you something, there is a reason we are showing, because we have to create this on the page. We have chosen to show this to you, and it is likely to be important.
Yeah.
As opposed to, this is just an illustration of what is happening. And that's one of the things that the Sandman did so well, was use the images as story.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of which, look at the ending. Oh my, or is it the beginning? I don't know. But it's the transition between the two, and you can see the eyeball with the needles in it, which is, obviously representing the Corinthians' role, but also the little skull creature. Now, at this point, the Sandman is pissed. He's coming after the Glob and Brute, or whatever their names are.
I say, he is such a drama queen. Oh yes, I am on my way. Look at him.
This little skull creature, I feel like is actually more reminiscent of him in his helmet there, in some ways. Like, he's not just a benign figure here. He's kind of badass and scary, and we see him creating these other dreams with these hollowed out, faces and dripping remnants of brain material inside, and he's not warm and fuzzy, right?
And the Corinthian was his creation too. It was a creation that went bad, or did not have enough ability to think for itself, perhaps, or whatever. But yeah, that was his creation too. You want to be angry at someone, be angry at him.
I mean, that's a great point, Varsha. And I feel like there's an echo there of Satan, and God in Milton's Paradise Lost, with the Corinthian, being a creation of dreams, and does what he does in the world, is it his doing, or can we ultimately blame Dream for it? As Satan sometimes seems to say, "Hey, God, you made me this way," So, I think there's some interesting material there for discussion. Gesundheit. Yeah.
Well, on that point, it's interesting that you brought up Milton, because I think Milton's Paradise Lost is fascinating in comparison to a lot of this, because take that section, the mind can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Right. And what we have is the creation of a dream world, which is a refuge for this woman who was pregnant, whose husband had died. And it was almost like creating their own paradise, living in the dream bubble thing that they had. And yet she's been pregnant the entire time. It's not real. It was arrested development. And for Jed, it's an escape from the hell and drudgery and torture of his everyday life. Again, it's this wonderful refuge for him. And it's all located in his mind. And so we have that being played out. We have the dream as not benevolent, but he's also not malicious. He just is. And so there's a complex morality at play that isn't quite as straightforward as good or evil. The Corinthian is a failed nightmare. Dream's annoyance at him is all of this time that the Corinthian has been on Earth, all of this time freed from control. And what did he manage to do? Inspired a small bunch of serial killers. You small, petty little dream. You are flawed. That you were meant to be the darkness of the human condition, the depth of their true nightmares. And that's it. That's what you came up with. That's what you inspired. That's nothing.
At least they came up with a good pun for their convention, the serial convention.
It's one of those, one of my favorite issues of the early stuff. But But Dream isn't annoyed that the Corinthian inspired serial killers. He's annoyed that the Corinthian only inspired a small group of serial killers. He wasn't nightmarish enough. He wasn't dark
Hmm.
enough. Because that's what he was meant to do. And that is a level of depth to Dream as a character that we sometimes overlook because as we go on this whole journey with him across the whole series, we want to like him. He is the Dream Lord, Lord of the Dreaming, and you go, yeah, but he's also an ass, and he is responsible for maintaining that balance of nightmare and positive dreams, of the darkness, and through defining those things, defining their opposites in reality. So I think Paradise Lost is a fascinating um, storyline, particularly here about this fall from grace and trying to make a life in the mortal realm and creating your own vision, your smaller vision of heaven.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So anyway, and then
This
go ahead, Varsha.
this is the Corinthians version of heaven, a bunch of serial killers.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the best he can do. Yeah. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, did you get any sense at all that Dream was upset with the Corinthian, that he had caused actual pain in the real world? Or was it really just, is that the best you can do, you loser? Okay.
Well,
Mm.
for me reading it,
Yeah.
look at how casually Dream says to Leda, "Oh yeah, I'll be back for your the child. It's mine. And
Mm.
it just did it in the dreaming for so long. I'll be back for the child. It belongs to me."
Right.
No consideration of the mother. But what am I meant to do? Well, you're free to live your life. Like, no consideration for others. It's only what he wants. Look at how he treated Nada. It's only what he wanted. He was just going to destroy Rose. No consideration of other ways of doing things. Because no, I just destroy the vortex because I'm not going to let that happen again. And that's the important point. One time he let it happen and it destroyed an entire world. He knows
Right.
what the stakes are. And so looking at it, he's like, yeah, but what's one human life in comparison to that? I'll just get rid of the human.
Mm.
And that's why the storyline with Hob, I think, is so important in contrast with all of this. It works as a counterpoint to all of this. But with one of the things that I loved is when we get those dreams of the other inhabitants in the house, when we see like Chantal and Zelda, like they dress in that very weird sort of bridal gothic
Yeah.
horror vibe with their stuffed spiders,
Yeah.
but their interiority, how they perceive themselves, is so radically different. And it's a side of them that we see this external perspective, and then we see what Chantal is dreaming about in her affair with the sentence, which is that wonderful sort of abstract notion and very playful. Um, we see Zelda's fear
Yeah.
and her isolation and the abuse that she suffered.
From her mother. Yeah.
Um, and we get that moment later on when they wake up and they hold each other, they comfort each other. Whereas Barbie and um, Ken is an ass, and they end up having a shouting match because it, it it's just wonderful articulations of this interiority, and it's not what they project to the outside world. Ken and Barbie, the happy, smiley, um, all-American couple, but that's not what they're dreaming.
Yeah,
That's
he's
not.
all about money and sex, and that's his interior world is dominated by money and sex, whereas she's in a little like a fantasy, with her friend. What was the friend's
Martin
name?
Tenbones.
Yeah, so great, Martin Tenbones. Uh, and they're very different worlds. And when he actually intrudes on her dream world, it's not welcome, right? And in that moment when Rose starts to erode the barriers between their various dreams, um, it's like he's not what they pretend during the daytime, and you can see that very evidently there. Yeah. So
And you get that with Hal as well. So Hal in the daytime and Dolly at night.
Yeah.
And the line, they all sing "Hello Dolly" when she appears on stage.
Right.
But we see that Hal had that dream of that man that he had met, and they had this wonderful love affair, and then that man obviously left him, and so he doesn't remember who the person turned out to be. It's the dream version of him, the perfect version. And then we see Hal's insecurities about who who is he, who are they, and it's the wearing one mask after another, and running out of hands holding the faces, and that as a just as a simple articulation, even if you're not questioning your or involved in any discussion about sexuality or gender or any of that, but the idea of who are you as a person, who do you project to the outside world, how true is that to your interiority, do we even know who we are on the inside? And we see that very direct visualization. So even if you can't connect to the specifics of Hal's situation, I think that's quite a poignant image of thinking about the different roles and aspects and personas that we have in various situations and trying to find the truth of ourselves.
Yeah.
So, again, and it's both bluntly done but wonderfully done, and it has that connection to our psychology.
Yeah. Excellent. I feel like we've talked about a lot of the things that do happen in Collectors, Into the Night, and Lost Hearts. So we want to finish talking about the Rose arc and then go talk about Men of Good Fortune, or do you want to now? I think we're basically on Men of Good Fortune at this point. Do you want to just talk about Men of Good Fortune or finish up with Rose?
Yeah. Varsha?
Do you have a preference, Varsha?
Yeah, I guess I'd vote for finishing the discussion on Rose. And
That's what we'll do then. So other, I think, very important moments is when ultimately at the cereal convention. I mean, I almost hate to laugh at this because all that stuff that goes down there, and you have all these serial killers with all these silly names. And at the same time, they're serial killers, and they do take the one guy out because he's pretending to be an attendee, and he's really just I guess, a fanboy. And they do their thing on him, and it's awful. And his name is Philip. How dare
I
you,
did
Neil
not
Gaiman?
notice that.
How dare you? So, but
And
yeah, I
it
mean,
was
there are some good moments there, like when Gilbert rescues Jed out of the trunk. Neil Gaiman has a thing for trunks, I guess. There's in American Gods, trunks played a role. But yeah, I mean, anything that you guys want to say about this up until, I guess, the last point where Rose has the major confrontation with Dream, and her grandmother, Unity, comes to the rescue essentially, and says, "Wait, I'm supposed to be the Vortex." We already talked about that a little bit, but any further thoughts on any of all that?
the serial killer chapter. I think it really competed for how deeply disturbing it is with the 24-hour chapter from the
Yes, I
last
agree.
volume.
I agree.
It made me very uncomfortable, and yeah, I guess it was interesting to read. I did wonder whether the names of the serial killers are from the news, from the history of serial killers in the country. I didn't actually go look it up, but um, because I am afraid I'd be terrified if I did. But I was curious about that.
Well, I honestly don't know. I will probably be looking it up as soon as this is over.
Yeah.
And then also sending a note to the FBI going, listen, I was looking at a comic book. That's why I am looking this up. But there are 2 points that I wanted to bring up here. If you look at the first sort of page, maybe 2 pages, look at all of the exchanges between the serial killers before we know that they are serial killers.
Oh, all
And
the puns.
every single exchange has violent language in it.
Yeah.
And if you don't know that that's the gag, if you don't know that's what the joke is,
All right.
that you're going through it, and
Like, I kill for a drink right now, you know.
Yeah.
all the way through. And it's just that, okay, so some of them may be a bit of a long walk and a stretch, but some of them fall very, very naturally. And just as you're reading it, you don't really pick up. And it's only when you realize that they're all serial killers that you go, oh, hang on a sec. And you go back and look at it, and every single word stands out.
Mm.
But I thought it was really interesting that you brought up the 24 hours in the diner issue, because that to me was really, really horror filled. And this, despite being horrific, was about the mundanity of evil.
Mm.
Because they're all at a convention. It's, well, like sitting on a discussion panel. Well, how do you dispose of bodies? And they're having this discussion about how can we make money out of this? Well, I don't do it for the money. Like, the mundanity of it, that this is the same as any other group that we see
Mm.
go to these sorts of conventions. They don't think of themselves as any different. And that when Dream
Just like ICFA.
strips,
Yeah.
but at the end, Dream's punishment is he takes back that ability to live in that dream version of reality.
Yeah.
That he goes, no, you're going to see exactly who you are, exactly what you did, without the
Mm.
comfort of that dream inspired by the Corinthian. You're going to live in reality. And we get that echo then of the same cold breeze, but instead of this time they're all being blown in, now they're leaving, and they're leaving as broken versions of themselves, because those dreams protected them from their evil, and they just saw themselves as normal. And that mundanity of it always struck me as almost more frightening than the over-the-top visceral horror and sort of gore of the 24 Hours episode.
Yeah. Another connection that comes up there is it turns out one of the victims in the cafe was a friend of Rose's, as it turns out.
Mm.
But the whole storyline with Funland, and he wears the wolf ears, and then we
Yeah.
get the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And
Yes.
Gilbert is very very careful to say an original version, not the original, because it's a folk tale. But again, it very dark, disturbing. And then when we get to the end, we see that, so in the fairy tale version, there was darkness in, and the Rose character essentially dying.
Yeah.
But in the real thing that happened, where she's been pursued by the wolf, she's saved and is set free.
By Dream, who later is going to kill her. Yeah.
Who's going to kill her? And I think the very first time I read this, one of the things that I reacted viscerally against in this was the character of Funland having the dream where all of his innocent victims welcomed him and played with him, and he was happy and smiling. And I'm like, he doesn't deserve that.
Right.
And it's still something like I still run up against that feeling seeing that panel. But that's his dream. And it's a difficult one for me.
Yeah. Also, Disney World will never be the same.
No one said it was Disney.
Uh-huh. He's got the Mouseketeer hat, only it's pointy. Yeah, I mean, right. Proprietary, I know, but it's Disney. Sorry.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, based on real events. So anyway, yeah. Anything else about that final confrontation with Dream coming to, and then having Gilbert, or his dream, his real name is
Fiddler's Green.
Yeah, Fiddler's Green. Coming to the rescue again, in a sense. He has learned some of the dreams that we see interacting with humans in our world are quite sinister, but Fiddler's Green is not. He becomes a great example, and he even says, I'm sorry I couldn't be a better human," but he's got some humility as well as compassion there. Wonderful character. and he ultimately helps stall at least things, and then who really comes to the rescue is of course Unity, realizing this is my role, and we don't mind her being, I guess, eliminated as much because she hasn't really gotten to live a life, though, has she? I mean, she's lived technically about 17 years of these 90 some odd years, right?
Hmm.
But she willingly takes the place of her granddaughter. So, any thoughts on that final confrontation, Varsha?
Um, I did want to go back just a
Oh,
little
sure,
bit
please go ahead. Yeah.
to when Dream comes to save. I just had a thought about it while you were talking, so I wanted to
Brilliant.
bring that up before we do the final discussion, final confrontation. But when um, Fiddler's Green Gilbert gives her the note with the name on it, uh,
Yeah.
we could he seemed sure that Morpheus would come and save her out of whatever she's going through. But then we also saw that Dream is kind of what not whimsical, that's not the word I want to use, but we don't know what he might do in a given situation, right? Like what AP said earlier about just being disappointed in the Corinthian, not because he's doing evil, but because this is all the evil he can manage. So it doesn't seem clear that he would save her, but Gilbert seemed sure. That I thought that was interesting. Where does his certainty come from that she would be saved? And that was one of the reasons that made me think that, like, I did not read what he was like. I thought he was chastising Corinthian for just doing evil, not for doing such petty evil. So maybe because of that, maybe because of the certainty that he would save her, I went to you're just scolding him for creating serial killers. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up for discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I feel like Dream has clearly, dreams do have the potential for compassion. Look at Gilbert, right? Look at Fiddler's Green. And I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's possible to have both motives simultaneously in a
Mm,
character like that. We have that these levels of complexity in this character where, yes, part of it is you're a failed nightmare by, Corinthian, but also a sense of the tragedy of what this nightmare has done in the world. And I don't know, do nightmares have a good purpose? Are they a event of a sort for people? Disturbing dreams and that sort of thing. In other words, our dreams, I don't think they feel good or evil. They just feel like expressions of our experience sort of oozing out of us in a chaotic form as we sleep
mm,
with little control over them. Um, and therefore, would an entity like Dream and what he represents, would it be capable of morality even? That I think that's an interesting question.
mm, mm,
If you want to
Well,
react
and
to what Marsha was
well,
saying?
and it all depends on how you're defining morality, because
Yeah.
from Dream's perspective, and given the realm that he operates in, is that the same as the human perspective in the realm that we operate in? But um, Gilbert, Fiddler's Green, knew that Matthew had been watching
mm,
Rose, and he had been drawn to Rose, and suddenly it's like, oh yeah, and here's the Corinthian, because you had that moment there in the lift, and Fiddler's Green looks up, sees the Corinthian, and he's like trying to hide because he's like, so he knows that the Corinthian is there, and Fiddler's Green isn't stupid. He's putting two and two together and goes, here's the Corinthian. I'm here. Matthew's here. Dream obviously has an interest in what is going on and an interest in this girl.
mm,
And so if you call him, he's going to turn up and he might get you out of the situation of immediate mortal peril because we're surrounded by a bunch of serial killers. But he also admits where you end up might be even worse
Yeah.
because
mm,
he knows the regard of a being like Dream of the Endless carries weight, and you can't always discern where that will take you. It's the idea of not catching the attention of the gods, because
Mm.
it's their favorites and the ones that they notice that terrible things happen to.
Hard to avoid that sort of thing when you're a vortex, though. And all these characters, these dreams are kind of swirling around her, and they come together, you know.
Um, and so, but I think that's why Fiddler's Green, noticing these connections, noticing that they were all being drawn together, seeing all of these things happen, is like, well, appeal to Morpheus, because he'll turn up and he can, because he has an interest in you, he will protect that interest until he does what it is that he wants to do, which no one can protect you from.
Mm.
So I thought that was it's how I kind of think about it in my head, if that makes any sense.
That makes sense. I don't know if this would be a valid way to think about it, but you also, when you're having a really bad nightmare, you can kick yourself out of it. So maybe dream can help you kick yourself out of it, if you
Yeah.
call it.
One of the things I love too about Rose's arc here, and I feel like it's come to a conclusion, and maybe she'll come up later, I don't know, but because Unity took over the vortex
Mm.
status and all of that, and it's taking care of the vortex. We don't have to worry about the destruction of the world or anything like that. But I love how we get the sort of aftermath and her depression and how she wrestles with it for months
Mm.
afterwards. And that decision where she has this agency and decides for herself, yeah, I'm going to go out and do something now. I've stayed around here long enough. It's time. And we see some healing happening with her and with Jed as well, and the mother. And there's a sense of family and a sense of promise for the future. I do like how this arc ends.
And I think there's a very neat mirror there too. Remember, Dream was imprisoned.
Yeah.
And we've seen him starting down this as well, reconnecting with death. And here, reconnecting with desire is maybe a very, very nice way of saying and talking about that. But we see that Dream is dealing with the ramifications of things and working through them. He's still processing it. But there's that nice mirror to Rose and her journey and how she grows and matures out of it. And I think that takes us on to discussing like an aspect of Hobbes' story.
Yes, Men of Good Fortune. Let's finish on that. And let's see, Dream and Death walk into a bar. And I love this because I'm a nerd, and I love the allusions that Neil Gaiman inserts in here. We get Chaucer in there talking about the Canterbury Tales. Later, we get Shakespeare talking to Christopher Marlowe, and he's not Shakespeare yet. He has to meet Dream in order for
He's
that.
still writing Henry VI.
Yeah,
Mm.
and he's sucking, and Marlowe's telling him, "You suck, Will. I'm sorry." And he's got, and Marlowe has his leg in a splint because he had a violent life, and ended up dying with a dagger in his head, I think, at least according to the story. But yeah, I love all the historical allusions in here. He picked his date well. Like, it starts in 1389. And
Mm.
it's after the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, because he talked about John Ball and Wat Tyler being gone. And they're just wonderful. But that's not what it's about, though. I mean, the theme here, as he revisits Hob every century, every 100 years, and we see the vicissitudes of Hobbes' life and how he's embracing this opportunity to just keep living forever and ever and make the most of it. And then you see him at certain points with real lows where he's lost his wife, he's lost his child who was killed, and he experiences the tragedy of an immortal being living among mortal beings. And there's just a lot of cool stuff in there. But I love the ending to this as well, which we need to talk about. What your thoughts, Varsha, on this particular Men of Good Fortune, this volume?
Oh, yeah, I really enjoyed this. The only reference I got was Shakespeare, and that one was like in my face, so of course I got it. But I was glad to know of all the others. I did love that it ended, what, 500 years later, almost the same way that it started. Very similar conversations. Every conversation in the tavern has parallels, I think, in the end when we come back in the 500 after 500 years. And then we were talking about this last time, Philip. I think you mentioned that Dream is finding more humanity and we saw how after he got freed of the crystal, he seemed more free somehow. Uh, so the contrast between the last 100 years when he says, "How dare you think that I would like to be friends with a mortal?" And then he comes back.
1889.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And after his imprisonment, he comes back and he's like, "Yeah, cool, friend. We're not going to talk about it first or anything. You're my friend now." So it's like he's had a chance to think about it, and some of the, not improvement, but changes in him, I suppose, finding humanity is what's being reflected here. Um, I thought that was cool.
Yeah, great point, Varsha. So you go from this panel in 1889, where it's, how dare you, suggest that I would need your friendship. I would need companionship. Obviously, he does. And then we go to this panel, which is in 1989, and he says, "I've always heard that it was impolite to keep one's friends waiting." Right? So that was nice. Yeah. So I love this. These for some reason, these little like separate sort of seeming ones have been my favorites so far. Like earlier, the one with Death, his sister.
Yeah.
That was my favorite from the earlier ones, and this is probably my favorite from among these. But what are your thoughts on it, AP?
Well, the initial framing of it, where Dream, when Dream and Death are working, it's like, why do you do this? And Death
Yeah.
is saying that she does this in order to connect with the people, that she needs to do this regularly in order to understand who she is and her function. And it's clear Dream has never considered actually interacting with mortals in this way. And yet we know the lie of that because he had the relationship with Nada.
Yeah.
And yet that was told in story form. We're not sure if that's exactly how it happened. But certainly his relationship with Nada, which we get a sense that at least something happened, whether or not it's exactly as it was relayed to us. But we know she ended up in hell as a suicide.
Yeah, I get
But
the sense that Death is ahead of Dream on this journey of learning about humanity, and that Death knows, almost sets this up not as an experiment for Hob, but as an experiment for Dream.
yeah,
And this is a learning thing that you can see the knowledge in her eyes here in this panel. And this is going to be a learning experience for you, little brother, So, yeah.
And so I liked how that sets that up. And we've seen in the characterization of Death in The Sound of Her Wings that Death is empathic. Death does care.
Yeah.
Whereas what we've seen of Dream is very cold and controlling and arrogant and hubristic. Now, so there's a basis for a lot of his actions, but he is cold and controlling. And I think you're absolutely right that Death, this wasn't about Hob, this was about the impact on Dream. That's why Death was interested and why Death isn't getting involved in Hob's life. Um, the second thing about this whole sequence that I loved is when Lady Constantine turns up.
Yeah, Joanna.
And she says that there's a story about the wandering Jew and the devil meeting every 100 years in this bar. And again, we see how
Hob says, "I'm not Jewish."
and Morpheus says, "And I'm not the devil."
Yeah.
But again, it's this idea of these stories having life and then stories conflating and being mixed in with other stories and then creating their own mythology. That I just like that sort of reference. But we see Dream making, because uh, in the background where Shakespeare is saying, I would bargain like your Faustus when he's talking to Kit. So I would bargain like your Faustus for a fraction of your talent.
Yeah.
And you can see Dream go, hang on a sec, be right back. So you're interested in doing, right, yeah.
What's your name again? Will. Okay.
Um, and so that sets up, because we know Shakespeare becomes one of the greatest storytellers. And now it's implied this is how he made a deal with Dream.
Well, the
Hmm.
connection between dream and story. And then, of course, you have plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, right?
Yeah.
So
When you and Varsha meet to talk about that, could I come back for that one, please?
absolutely. Yeah, because I guess that's the name of I mean, you're actually you're on the hook now. You have to come back. Sorry. In fact, you can even be the host. I think for that'll be among the next 8, right? So
Or 7. I'm not sure the next volume how many it has, but I should have brought my copy. But
we'll
yeah.
figure that out later. But we'll make AP host that one.
But one of the things that I find fascinating about this sequence, when Hobb reveals that he's involved in slavery just as an economic pursuit,
Yeah.
and Dream says he makes a moral judgment about it.
He's learning.
And for me, while I think that reassures the reader that Gaiman and Dream in no way condone slavery, it always struck me as a slightly odd note that Dream was making a moral judgment about this, given that he is so far removed. And it's only after his imprisonment that he develops empathy. Because when you compare how he spoke to Nada and how
Hmm.
he treated Nada, so at that moment, that feels almost like I need to reassure the reader about this. Um, but
He seems to have a
at,
sense of justice. Let's call it that rather than morality. He has a sense
Hmm.
of justice earlier.
um, and then when Hobb reappears, obviously, and he's like, "Yeah, that was a mistake."
Bad idea. Yeah.
Um, that I thought was actually like nicely done in it. Here's a dark, very dark moment, particularly in British history, because the British were very good at the slave trade and made a lot of money out of it, while at the same time trying to pretend to keep their hands clean.
Yeah.
And it's an acknowledgement that no, this is part of how a lot of people made their fortunes in the UK.
Right.
And it's not just the fun Shakespeare references. It's referencing aspects of history that seeing the change, and even Hobbes' commentary that people going, oh, like this is terrible. He goes, oh, we see in my day it was even worse. Like you think that's bad, but and Hobbes is seeing it from that perspective of now being external to it, and then suffers the being chased out and almost being killed basically for being a witch
Hmm.
because he is now external to it. And so he's starting to empathize more and more with Dream's position. And that's how we then end up. Eventually, Dream comes around and starts to empathize with Hobbes' position.
Yeah.
And it's someone for him to talk to.
And in a
Hmm.
scene too, where it's 1989 and it's a much more diverse, London at that point, and acceptance of that diversity. So there's been a sense of, I guess, progress in that way as well. So
Hmm.
wonderful. Any other final thoughts on either this part, the Men of Good Fortune, or on these 8 episodes, issues as a whole? Any final thoughts, Varsha?
Oh, I wanted to say I loved this page where the dreams all merge together.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what my camera is doing. I'm sorry, but it's purple and it's really pretty with all the cloud things all merging together when Rose is blending the dream world.
Yeah.
And and also, I mean, this was interesting that with Jed, the walls were thickening or getting stronger, and Rose was using the thinness of the walls to break down the dreams. He had one wall with the fortress of dreaming, and Rose was blending all the dreams together. But um, just the use of walls there, I thought was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And there are these lines about the thinness of the barrier between us. There's at one point where Rose is thinking of our experience as being like there's a well, and there's this very thin layer of scum on the surface of the well, and that's what we see in the waking
Mm,
world. And who knows how deep that well is, you know? You fall
mm,
through that little thin layer of scum, and there's all this stuff on the other side that's just at the basis of our existence. And we spend most of our waking lives not thinking about it. But it's
mm.
lurking, you know, and it's deep and it's dark and primal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. Great stuff. Yeah. Final thoughts, AP?
Um, just to say thank you very much to be part of this discussion with you.
Oh,
Like this series, it means an incredible amount to me, as I alluded to. In addition to be really, really interesting, and it's a series in which the written word, the imagery, the structure of how things are organized on the page. There are so many different elements, and in certain issues, even more so, that communicate a wealth of information that spending an hour or 2 hours on every single issue is more than feasible.
oh yeah.
And I know that, we skated through a lot of this. We were touching on points. We were talking about general things arising from it and not doing like a sort of a deep breakdown or the equivalent of a close reading of a lot of the stuff. And I appreciate you involving me in this because I love talking about good storytelling, no matter what medium it is. And this is one of my favorites. So thank you.
Well, we appreciate you being involved, and now you're gonna have to host the next one. so, so we'll be doing the next, I don't know, we'll figure it out, 8 or
Yeah.
so issues. We'll figure out that, and in maybe a month or so, we can reconvene and discuss those on A Critical Dragon. And I want to thank both of you for this discussion, and thank everybody else. Please give us your thoughts on the Sandman as it is in the first at least 16 issues, because I haven't read any further than that. But Varsha, you haven't either, have you?
I did read the entirety of the series about a
Yeah.
decade ago, but
Oh,
I
okay.
don't
So
remember any of it.
this is a reread for you then.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. It'll be like a dream then for you,
Yeah.
rereading.
Like things from a remembered dream.
Yes, exactly. All right. I've reached my level of allowed puns for a day, so we have to say goodbye now. We'll see you all later. Until next time.